this week, I'm going to, of course, be moving on to talk about the topic of the Greco-Persian Wars. Of course, a major historical event in ancient Greek history. It's kind of an event that really kind of, paves the way for what will be kind of the greatest period, really in Greek history, especially if you read Herodotus, his works. We'll talk about that today. Of course, we'll discuss also the rise of the Persian Empire. They're the reason why, of course, this major series of wars, of course, which occur over something like 50 years at one point. So I'll talk about that. Now, talk about a little bit about the post period after the Greco-Persian Wars because the peak of the Greek city-state kind of declines after that war in the Peloponnesian War as well. So if you have any comments, questions during the live stream, do let me know. Of course, where you could also leave comments on my channel as well. Any students could also leave comments, questions, of course, in discussions in Canvas. You can also email me if you had a question, of course, about the class as well. So anyway, of course, the Greco-Persian Wars, like I said, it occurred over a period of 50 years. Kind of give you the dates for it right here, but it mostly pitted in the early 5th century BC between what is the Achaemenid Empire, is what they called it. Usually called the First Persian Empire because there was more than one. I think it was at least 3 major Persian empires that existed in around Iran. And against the Greek city-states, of course, that fought it. You can see 499 to 449 BC is the years of when the actual Greco-Persian Wars took place. It is called different names. Of course, some people just call it the Persian Wars for short as well. And I'll get to Herodotus later. He's, of course, one of the major historians that writes about the wars. Now, so I did want to kind of share with you right there. So, yeah, that's the actual name of the actual Persian Empire, the First Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire, which is actually the dynasty that ruled over it for, I think, something like 200-something years that it was around. But you can see the rise of the Persian Empire. It occurs in the Near East, in what we call ancient Iran. I'll kind of get to it in a second. Right here. Here's kind of a map showing you, of course, the Persian Empire. Of course, considered a massive empire, by the way, one of the largest in history. The Achaemenid Empire, it's kind of like at one point they believe it was over 2 million square miles, stretching from close to where India is. The Hindu Kush is kind of like the eastern border of it. You can see it stretched into Iran, which is where it started. And then, of course, it included part of Iraq, Turkey, Egypt. And then at one point, it did expand into Greece at one point. This empire was huge. I think they say at one point they controlled something like 30 to 40% of the known population of the world. I think their population may have been possibly 50 to 60 million people. So very large in size. So it's like one of the largest empires in history so far. In fact, it was one of the first that controlled 3 continents, believe it or not. Most of Southwestern Asia, part of North Africa, then part of Europe with Greece as well. Of course, that was the founder. Of course, Cyrus the Great. We'll talk a little bit about him. We've kind of mentioned about Cyrus the Great before. He's also known as King Cyrus II. He was, of course, a famous monarch of ancient Iran that lived in the 6th century BC. So he founded the empire close to about 559 BC. And he's the one that actually, I guess, the one that kind of calls it Achaemenid dynasty, which was actually named after a great-great-grandfather of his named Achaemenes, who may have been one of the first kings of Persia. And this dynasty of kings, which had like 17 kings at one point in it, reigned down to about 330 BC before it was actually conquered by Alexander the Great, which we'll, of course, talk about that later. It had different capitals, by the way, kind of listed right here, but Pasargadae was one of the Pasargadae was one of the actual original capitals that was founded by Cyrus the Great, like in southern Iran today. And then there was a later capital added, which is called Persepolis. That's the one that people know more about, I think, today more than anything, because the ruins of it are in southern Iran. But that particular capital was founded later by Darius the Great, who was kind of like a cousin of Cyrus the Great overall. Oh, by the way, going back to that map I was showing you earlier, which is right here, you look here, they think that in ancient Iran a long time ago, which, by the way, Iran supposedly means in Persian, land of the Aryans. It's believed that the ancient Iranians were related back to Indo-Aryan peoples that came out of like where the Caucasus Mountains are between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They kind of came down there and settled in Iran something like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And so usually the peoples that settle in Iran are called Indo-Iranians. I think I've talked about that before because the ones in India are called Indo-Aryans, kind of, differentiate between those two different peoples. But those are the peoples that will settle there and the ones that eventually end up, creating this actual state of Persia. And by the way, Persia itself, the empire, was made up of multiple states. They believe that what happened was the Persian Empire formed out of the kingdom of Persia, which Cyrus originally ruled, which I think Susa was one of the early cities, and then Pasargadae was another city that, of course, that he built, which became its capital. And then what happened was they think Cyrus conquered the kingdom of Media, which is in northern Iran. They're called the so-called Medes. And they had a city and capital called Ecbatana. And so those two states were merged together, and that's what formed the basis of the early first Persian Empire, or so-called Achaemenid Empire as well. They did absorb other states too. I'll mention the Scythians were also absorbed into this empire, which Scythians were up in the close to where Armenia is in that map, kind of between the Caspian and the Black Sea, where they lived, called Scythia, which was a kingdom at one point in Iran, ancient Iran. And then Bactria, the Bactrians, was a kingdom that was kind of in the northeastern part of Iran, close to the Caspian Sea, and it was absorbed also into the empire as well. But you can see most of the empire itself. I think I've got another map here I can kind of share with you right here. You can see all the areas that were conquered that eventually formed into this empire. So those areas that are kind of in that pinkish color, I guess, orange pink color right there, those areas that Cyrus the Great first conquered, which included Media. Of course, they began pushing it eastward towards the Indus River. And then, of course, they pushed, you can see, westward towards Turkey. And eventually, Cyrus the Great also conquers Lydia, the kingdom of Lydia, in 547 BC. And then he also conquered, you can see as well, the Babylonian Empire. Member of Nebuchadnezzar, it fell to the Persians in 539 BC. And you can see all the area where Israel is in Syria, all that was also absorbed into it as well. So the bulk of the empire was conquered by Cyrus the Great, and then other relatives came later. There was Cambyses, he was a son of Cyrus the Great, conquered also Egypt, you can see, 525 BC as well. So that's kind of showing you like some of the different areas that were conquered over time with this empire. But yeah, it's a huge empire. the largest in history so far, of course, at that point. There, of course, is the tomb of Cyrus the Great you're looking at right there, which was at the ruins now of Pasargadae, of course, I talked about, which was the original capital, of course, in southern Iran now. They also had Darius the Great. We'll talk more about him in the Persian Wars as well. He kept expanding the empire. They think by his reign, the empire had expanded all the way into get close to Greece. They started pushing into Greece a little bit at that point. Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to the Indus River. They expanded at one point. So under him and his son Xerxes the Great, is really the peak size of the Persian Empire between the 6th and the 5th centuries. Some other things about Darius that are very famous you may have heard about. Darius is the one that constructed the Royal Road. I don't know if you know much about the Royal Road, but the Royal Road was a famous highway system of the Persians that was constructed from what is southern Iran, and it went through Iraq into all the way to Turkey, western Turkey. So you can see where it started in Susa and went up through close to where Babylon is, and then you can see it pushed westward to Sardis, which is one of the main capitals that was in the western part of Turkey under the empire. And this highway system they built of the Persians was almost 1,700 miles in length. I think the actual length I've looked up is 1,677 miles long. So it's something around that length, basically. And it was important later, not just connecting, throughout the whole Persian Empire and, trade within its empire, but it obviously made it easier for like the Persian army to march east to west across the empire. It's also important too, because if you know about the Royal Road, it was kind of considered part of the leg of the Silk Road later, like the end of it, I guess, as it goes from east to west towards Constantinople. That'll be like the end leg of it, of course, which will be important. Herodotus, I think, was one of the first to write about it in his histories of Herodotus. He talks about how it took around a week or so for riders, like on horseback, to go from say that they had to go from Turkey to, I guess, Iran. It would take something like 7 to 9 days. I think is usually what it was. If you had to walk on foot, though, it took about 3 months to go from east to west or vice versa. So that's pretty amazing about that. I think that's an image kind of showing you like part of the road. I think parts of the road still exist in like Iran and other areas of the world. But like I said, it was part of the leg of the Silk Road, at one point. Of course, the other thing that he did that's very famous, I was talking about, is he built Persepolis, which, of course, if you know about this, became the capital of the Persian Empire. They think it was built sometime between 518 and 515 BC, roughly. So sometime at the end of the 6th century is when the Persians began constructing it under Darius the Great. And the ruins of it are in southern Iran, close to a city called Shiraz. I think I want to say 30, 40 miles from it. That's where it is. And it's, if you know about it, it's famous later for Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the late 4th century, and he destroyed the city and burned it down. And so that's why today the city is nothing but ruins now because of what happened with the Greek conqueror Alexander the Great. A few other things about Darius I did want to mention also as well. Darius was the one that divided the Persian Empire into 20 provinces, which are called a satrapy, I think is what they call the actual province of the Persian Empire. And each of these provinces were ruled by a viceroy or viceroyal governor who acted for the king, usually, put in power by the king. But a lot of times they would use local officials, sometimes that were, pro-Persian, and they were called a satrap, basically. And so the satraps were something that the Persians invented, and in other states, like I know Alexander the Great borrowed it, and other states that came later also used that as well. Darius also standardized their coinage system as well, which they think a lot of their monetary ideas were influenced by the kingdom of Lydia in Turkey, which was one of the first to start using like gold coins and things like that. And then I think their official languages were Aramaic and Old Persian is mostly what they used under his reign. Now they have a later monarch I'll get to later, which is Xerxes the Great. Xerxes is probably considered the peak ruler, really, of the Persian Empire. It's when it was at its largest size. And Xerxes, is going to be the one that's going to eventually push the empire into parts of Europe and try to conquer Greece, which he eventually failed, of course, in the so-called Greco-Persian Wars. One more thing I did want to mention about Persia before I move on. They had a different religion compared to what the Greeks had. The Greeks had, Zeus and all those different gods I'll kind of talk about later. You can kind of see here's kind of a map too showing you his empire, Xerxes later, of course. But they had this religion called Zoroastrianism that spread throughout that region that the Persians controlled in the Near East. And Zoroastrianism was like a Persian religion. It was like their main religion. They had other religions too, like Judaism and Egyptian religions and so on, probably religions in Babylon, etc. But this was a main religion of Persia that was around for a long time. It was used by the Parthian Empire, the Sassanid Empire as well, and it had different names. Some people called it Mazda Yasna because of the god Ahura Mazda that was real popular. And it was a type of religion that was founded by this Iranian prophet whose name was Zoroaster. I think I've got an image of Zoroaster right here. And he lived about, there's kind of debate about when he lived. He either lived somewhere between 600 to about 1000 BC. And he adopted this god named Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was some type of Persian god that was associated with creation. And he was also seen as the god of wisdom, like all knowledge. In fact, his name in Persian supposedly means wise lord. And so he began to adopt this god. They think they had other gods too, but they eventually got rid of them over time, and they went to one god. I think I've got a map showing you, but at one point, Zoroastrianism was pretty widespread throughout the world. So it's considered one of the first widespread religions to spread all over the world. So I think it spread at one point towards India, where some people still practice it, by the way. You can see base mostly centralized in Iran and Afghanistan, but you can see it pushed into like Iraq, Turkey, and even pushed as far west as like Egypt and maybe into Greece at one point as well. You'll see a lot of images of Ahura Mazda, usually a man, like a winged type man, almost like a solar symbol, I guess, in a sense, you're looking at right there. But yeah, it was considered a creator god, like the god that created everything and so on, but believed to be a god of all knowledge in general. And the one thing about Ahura Mazda, if you study about the religion, it was one of the first religions that really had concepts of things like the idea of Satan, the idea that there were good and evil, angels and demons. Those are ideas that they kind of pushed forth that influenced other religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc. So yeah, it was a religion that influenced a lot of people theological wise, etc. But yeah, it's like around for several centuries. But over time, what happened was when Islam spread to the Middle East or Near East, they eventually stamped it out. So very few people practice it anymore. I want to say 100 to 200,000 is how many people practice it now throughout the world. I think it's mostly in Iran, and I want to say India. It's kind of popular. Let me get to the main thing, of course, today, which is the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, which I told you break out at the beginning of the 5th century BC. Kind of go to this slide right here, but you can see the main reason why the Persian Empire broke out was because of this event that happened between 499 to 494 BC, which was the so-called Ionian Revolt. That happened. What was the Ionian Revolt? It was this conflict between the Persian Empire and Greek city-states that were in Western Turkey, an area that's called Ionia. And that area did not want to be under Persian rule. So here, kind of slide right there about that. But states like Miletus and a few others all revolted because they didn't really want to pay taxes to the Persians, didn't want to be under Persian rule. I think it was a case where they even had to serve in Persian armies, like give allegiance to Persians. The Persians even tried to put in tyrants to rule over their states that were all pro-Persian. And so this was kind of an unpopular thing. And so 499, they revolted against the Persians. Here's kind of some other images right here, but they think it's happened under Darius the Great. Of course, when the revolt breaks out, and Darius is going to have to come in and put it down, like sack basically cities like Miletus that revolt against the Persians. And there was a case, here's kind of a map showing you right here, but what happened was the Greeks, I think it was mostly Athens was the main one behind it. And there's another state called Eretria, which was on the island of Euboea. They sent forces to help the Ionians in Western Turkey. And they marched over land and they attacked the city of Sardis, which Sardis was one of their satrapal capitals that was in Turkey at the time. I don't think they were to take the city, but they did sack and burn it. And so that's kind of what starts the war at that point afterwards, because Darius the Great's angry about this. He's angry because of the fact that city-states like Athens are supporting this rebellion against the Persian Empire. Darius eventually succeeds. He actually puts down the revolt. And I think Miletus was sacked at one point after that. And so that's initially what starts the war at this point, with Darius sending forces to attack Greece. Now, by the way, the actual main historian that writes about the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, is Herodotus. And of course, we know up here in this image right here, you can see Herodotus wrote a series of books which chronicleize Greek history at the time. It's sometimes called either the Histories of Herodotus, or sometimes they do call it the History of the Persian Wars, because that's mostly what the wars are about. He also included a history of Egypt, if you know about it, because Egypt was, at the time controlled by Persia, which they did for something like 200 years at one point. His is the oldest source, by the way, so you have to pretty much rely on Herodotus for information about all the battles and conflicts that took place between Greece and Persia. He is prone to exaggeration, which a lot of ancient historians are. I think he said when Xerxes invaded around 480 BC, he said they had 2 million troops or more. So kind of an exaggeration. But a lot of the quotes of famous men that were in like the I guess in the war were gotten from him overall. Here's kind of a map here. You can see the actual map of the Persian invasions, which there's 2 main invasions they'll have. One in 490, which started by King Darius the Great, and then his son Xerxes the Great has a second invasion in 480 BC. But you can see that the first invasion of Darius, that orange line, he sends a fleet with of course troops to attack Athens and Greece right there. And that's what begins pretty much the Greco-Persian Wars in mainland Greece. That leads, of course, to one of the first battles, really, of the whole war in the Greek mainland, of course, which is the Battle of Marathon, which happened, by the way, in September of 490 BC. It's considered really not just the first major battle in the actual Persian Wars, but they think in European history. And sometimes they talk about the Trojan War and all that, but they're not sure if that was real or not. But it is considered one of the first major battles in European history. And yeah, it's a turning point in the war because I'll get to it later. Darius is not successful, of course, in this conflict. The actual force is not led by Darius. It's led by this general named Datis. Yeah, Datis was a Persian general. And it also included a Greek tyrant we've talked about named Hippias. He actually had been kicked out of Athens and wanted to take back power. And so they think what was going to happen was Darius was going to conquer Athens and put him as a tyrant to basically rule over it. I guess he was going to try to take over Greece, was his main goal. Here's where they fought. They fought on what is called the Plain of Marathon, which is, by the way, in the Attica Peninsula, it's about 26 miles near Athens. And anyway, here's kind of an image, of course, of the Battle of Marathon on the right. There was actually about 10 generals of the Athenians that were actually there at the battle. The main general, though, that led the forces into battle was a general named Miltiades. If you know about the Greeks, a general was called a strategos, is what they called it. And Miltiades, supposedly in this battle, was one of the first to use what they call a double envelopment, where they attacked the Persians from multiple sides on their left and their right flank. And the Greeks were heavily outnumbered. The Greeks had something like 10,000 hoplites, and the Persians had 30,000 troops. But if you look at this map here of the battlefield, the Persians were just coming off their ships. And so the Greeks were able to attack them at the best time before they could organize all their forces. And I don't think that was the majority of their forces. I think they had more force than that, including cavalry. And so when the Persian force came up, they concentrated more of their forces on the left and the right. According to Herodotus, the Persian force was routed in the battle. It was just a lopsided battle where the Persians suffered close to 6,400 casualties, and the Greeks, according to Herodotus, 192, if you believe those numbers. But evidently it was a lopsided battle, and they actually chased the Persians back onto their ships, and they were forced to flee at that point. I think I've got another image of the battlefield, which is right there, but I don't think they got all their forces out to really fight in the battle. Of course, there's a famous incident that happened afterwards you may have heard about. It's a so-called marathon run of Phidippides that happened right afterwards. And Phidippides was some kind of Greek herald that was sent supposedly to Sparta to try to get aid for the Athenians in the battle, but they didn't send forces till later, until the battle was over. And so what happened, supposedly after the Greeks won Marathon, he ran all the way to Athens, like 26 miles. And the story is mentioned by different writers. It's actually mentioned by Herodotus, who calls him Phidippides. And then there's another writer, he's a Roman writer writing about 2nd century CE, named Lucian. Lucian calls him Philippides. So he does have different names that he's called. But supposedly what Lucian says is that he got there and told them that they had won the battle. He supposedly said something like Nikamen, which means in Greek, we won, victory, and he dropped dead. Now, if you know about it later, when they have the Olympic Games, like the modern games in 1896, they invented the so-called marathon run to honor the marathon run of Phidippides from Marathon to what is Athens, 26.2 miles or 42 kilometers. And so that's something that is something that started at that point. So the marathon run was something that wasn't really invented until modern times, but supposedly associated with this battle, famously in history. Some people think it's not even real, like mythological more than anything, but it's a very famous story, of course, told by Herodotus and the Roman writer Lucian. Now, they do have a second invasion. Darius gave up and went home back to Persia. He was assassinated, and his son took over, which is King Xerxes. Xerxes is involved in a massive invasion of Greece, which takes place between 480 to 479 BC, which there's kind of a debate about how large of an army this Persian force was. Some people think it was 250,000 to about 300,000 in size. And Herodotus claimed it was like 2 million or more. I think 2.3 million may have been, I thought, what he said, or something like that. Some huge size, which is totally ridiculous, but they do think it was one of the largest armies ever amassed in history. And the one thing that's different about Xerxes, if you know about it, he brought his navy over, but he took most of his force by land through northern Greece. So he invaded through northern Greece. And I kind of got some maps to kind of share right there. There's Xerxes, of course, in that image. But look at this map right here. He actually took his force and they actually marched right below where the Sea of Mara is, which is kind of like right below the Black Sea. And they crossed an area that's called the Dardanelles Strait, which a long time ago the Greeks used to call it the Hellespont. And there's a story where Herodotus said that Xerxes actually built a bridge across the Dardanelles Strait, maybe close to a mile in length, eventually using pontoon bridges, which was pretty amazing at the time. And he claimed that the first bridge collapsed, and he actually had all the men killed that failed to build it the first time, and he got men out, and they whipped the water, tried to get the water to cooperate, and then he built the second bridge, and then they marched across. So yeah, they come down, you see through Thrace, Macedonia, those areas will be invaded by Xerxes' forces. Because of that invasion, what ends up happening is the Greeks eventually form an alliance together. So you get this deal where the Greek city-states band together to form a military league, kind of like a Greek league or Hellenic league. And they realize that if they don't band together, put up forces to fight the Persians, they're going to get conquered by them. So I'll kind of talk about what the Greeks did at that point. Their strategy was to basically send forces into northern Greece, and they tried to block two areas, the Thermopylae Pass and the Artemisium Strait. Both those were areas on the northern part of Greece that they tried to block to slow down the Persian invasion so that they could send reinforcements up to try to meet the onslaught of the Persians. And I think they also they used that time to evacuate the southern areas because they knew that the Persians were going to come down and sack a lot of cities. So they did that also as well. I think I've got some other maps right here, but you can see the map. That's where they cross right there, by the way. So the Hellespont would be right below the Sea of Mara. It actually crosses over from Turkey to what is the Gallipoli Peninsula. And so from there, they marched up into that western part of Turkey. You see below the Black Sea, and then into Thrace in northern Greece from there. Here's another map to show you, of course. So Thermopylae in that circle right there was one area where the Greeks sent forces to block the Persians. Now, if you look up there on the top of the island of Eboa, they also sent naval forces to where Artemisium is, so-called Strait of Artemisium, to try to block the Persian Navy from going down through there, which was supplying Xerxes' forces. They failed at that. They also kind of failed at Thermopylae too, as well, because the Persians break through, but they do slow it down for a few days. Now, of course, the most famous thing you know about, of course, that second invasion is the Battle of Thermopylae. And the Greeks sent a small force, maybe up 7,000 men, led by that famous king there you're looking at, King Leonidas of Sparta, who's famous Spartan king, of course, well known to the Battle of Thermopylae. That's a famous painting, by the way, by Jacques-Louis David. It was done, I think, in the late 18th century. Leonidas at Thermopylae. So he led about 7,000 troops, which included mostly city-states from Thebes and Thespia. Yeah, Thespia was the other state that was involved. And then he had about 300 Spartan soldiers, crack troops that were under him as well. So they had like 7,000 men to hold the pass against probably 300,000 Persians that were going to, break through at that point. So they were vastly outnumbered, by the way, at the Battle of Thermopylae. That's the actual battle site, by the way, of Thermopylae today. If you know about Thermopylae, originally it was a narrow battlefield because you had the sea to the east, of course, and then the mountains to the west that were there. And Thermopylae is, by the way, the name, if you wonder about it, it's called Thermopylae because there's some nearby hot springs that are there. And so the term Thermopylae actually means hot gates, is what the translation of it. And so people would bathe in those springs that you're looking at. But the battle itself took place in August of 480 BC, is when they actually fight. Here's kind of another aerial view of the actual battlefield. So at one point, the water came up where that line is. You can see shoreline at 480 BC. And then you can see how narrow it was that the troops had to go through. Got mountains to the west of it. And so it was a very narrow pass where the road went through, of course, between that, northern Greece, and into what they call Boeotia, which is below. Here's kind of another image, of course, of the Battle of Thermopylae. It was a 3-day battle. And part of why it was 3 days was because the battle was, like I said, a very narrow pass. The Persians couldn't get their whole force in there. And so the Greeks had superior numbers because of this. And so, like I think in 2 days or so, the Persians suffered like something like 20,000 casualties trying to take the pass, according to Herodotus. I think they end up, I want to say the Greeks lose 4,000 men. The Persians lost like 20,000, trying to take the pass. And part of why the Persians were able to eventually break through, there was a Greek trader that gave away information about a pass that went around Thermopylae. His name was Ephialtes. You may have heard of him, which, by the way, Ephialtes in Greek today means nightmare, believe it or not. He wasn't Spartan. I think it was a case where some movies have claimed he was a Spartan. He actually wasn't. He was actually from a nearby city-state that was in that area. And he did it for money, basically gave them information for money. And so the Persians were able to outflank Leonidas' forces. And so at that point, what happened, Leonidas had to basically retreat with some of his forces, and he left a rear guard with himself to try to slow him down. And so the rest of the men, like 1,500, fought to the death, of course, on the third day. So that's the famous Battle of Thermopylae, of course, with that. And there's a statue there at the site now, which was later put in modern times, which you see on the left I thought I have another image of it, which is right there. And supposedly in Greek, it says something like, come and take them or come and get them, which supposedly was a quote that Leonidas told the Persians when they asked them to surrender on the first day, which they refused. And so Leonidas, of course, became later a very famous hero in, of course, the Greco-Persian Wars. A lot of poems were later, of course, written about him as well. But yeah, the Persians seized the pass. I think they were so mad about Leonidas' forces trying to slow them down that they found his body and they cut his head off and they put it on a pike, if you know about that. But they do think that the battle might have demoralized the Persian forces. Some claim it was kind of like a Pyrrhic victory for Xerxes' forces, but they did eventually come down the pass. So I've got a map showing you here right there. But after Thermopylae, you can see Xerxes' forces would actually attack down into Boeotia, which they sacked the city-state of Thebes. Then they attacked Attica, and they also sacked Athens as well. So behind me, you know, the Acropolis, at least the old Parthenon Temple Athena, was actually burned by Xerxes' forces, but most of the city-states like Athens had actually been evacuated at that point to what is the island of Salamis. That's another thing I wanted to talk about too. That's also famous. I did want to get into, which is what happens afterwards. They have, of course, the famous Battle of Salamis, which really, in the end, ends up being the most famous battle, really, of the actual Greco-Persian Wars, because it's considered the one that's the turning point of the wars. And what happened was, like I said, the Greeks had evacuated that area, like Attica, and I think that's part of Boeotia. They evacuated people towards what is the Isle of Salamis, which is in the Saronic Gulf. It's kind of between what would be Attica and the Peloponnese Peninsula. And the Greek Navy had also sailed down there too, to where that is. This man here in that image right there, they were talking about in that short video at the beginning, Themistocles would end up being the hero of the Battle of Salamis, which, you know, was a naval battle. And Themistocles was an Athenian politician, but he was also a pretty good general that had a lot of military experience that went back to the Battle of Marathon. And Themistocles had talked the Athenians a few years before into building something like 200 triremes, which would be very, very vital in the Battle of Salamis, because the trireme would end up being the thing that really changes the whole war in the end. And so that's really what it was. You know, Athenian naval power played a major role in the Battle of Salamis, because I want to say 2/3, I want to say 60-70% of the actual Greek Navy at Salamis was actually Athenian warships that were there. Here, by the way, is an example, of course, you know, the so-called triremes we talked about before. They're very famous. There's kind of a replica that they built. The Greek Navy has this ship called the Olympias, you may have heard of. So it's a trireme that was reconstructed back then, like in the 1980s. And the average trireme weighed about probably 40 tons, 40-ton ship, powered by oars with sails. Average trireme was about 120 feet in length. Had about 170 oarsmen, maybe about 200 men total on a ship. And the average speed of a trireme was about 9 knots, which, if you want that in miles per hour, about 10 miles per hour. But the thing that they're known for is that bronze ram that's on the front. They would use that to ram ships and sink them, or try to also damage their oars is another thing that they would do. That's actually the shirt I'm wearing. I think you can see that or not. But that's the ship Olympias. That little T-shirt I've been wearing, of course, a trireme. Yeah, that would end up, being considered really the turning point of the whole war, is because of the trireme. Here's kind of a map too, where the actual battle took place, right there, and the Greek Navy had about 370 something ships. Kind of varies how many they had. Somewhere like 370, 380 was about how many triremes they had. Then the Persian Navy had 1,200 ships. The Battle of Salamis, which took place, by the way, in September of 480 BC, and got that image right there. And then you can see also this image kind of shows you the Greek Navy where they're at versus the Persian Navy. And part of why the Persians lost the Battle of Salamis was because the Greek Navy, their warships were superior. With the trireme and of course the rams that are on the front, they would use that to sink a lot of their ships. And then they also think that the narrow pass, like that Strait of Salamis, Xerxes' navy couldn't get all their forces in. They had 1,200 ships, but they couldn't get all their ships in. And so the Greeks end up sinking or capturing something like 200 to 300 Persian ships, according to Herodotus. And so I think they end up losing something like only 40, to kind of give you an idea. So Salamis is very important. It eventually forces Xerxes to evacuate his forces because his navy was badly damaged in the battle. He does have this Persian general named Mardonius that he leaves behind to try to maybe march into the Peloponnese. But what happens is the Greeks, like in the Peloponnese, like Sparta, Athens, Corinth, all band together, and they bring up forces. They annihilate what's left of Mardonius's Persian force at the Battle of Plataea, which is later in 479 BC. But that's pretty much the end of the main Greco-Persian Wars that are fought in the mainland of Greece at that time. They do keep fighting. If you study about the Persian Wars, they keep going down to about 450 BC. That's when they fight. And then later, I'll get to it, when we get to Alexander the Great, they continue the wars. Alexander's going to invade Persia and defeat it by 330 BC. And that's something we'll probably talk about next week. So yeah, here's kind of a map you can see here. But yeah, I think the Persians were going to try to maybe march where the Isthmus of Corinth is and down into the Peloponnese. But their force was annihilated at the Battle of Plataea, which is kind of west of Thebes. And then from there, pretty much Xerxes gives up on any hope of conquering the mainland. But Xerxes still has control, of the Aegean. Like, he takes a bunch of the islands in the Aegean. He's still got control of Western Turkey and part of Thrace. And so that's why the Greeks are going to continue the war to try to push them out. I want to get to a last phase today, too, and talk about the aftermath also of the Greco-Persian Wars, which follow. And they do have a period that comes next, which is called the Golden Age of Athens, which it's got different names. They call it, some people call it they call it the Age of Pericles, also the Golden Age of Greece. I think is kind of another name they nickname it. But it's kind of a peak period of the Greek city-state, but especially with Athens at the helm, because Athens kind of forms this empire throughout the region, which is called the Athenian Empire. And a little bit about this empire, we go to this slide right here. You can see that what happened was Athens began to rebuild itself after the war. They used it with an alliance that is called the Delian League. What was the Delian League? I'll kind of put it on the screen here for you, but the Delian League was this confederation of Greek city-states that were throughout the Aegean. Parts of Greek mainland, islands in the Aegean, Western Turkey, part of Thrace. And it formed in 478 BC. And part of why it formed initially was to form an alliance to fight Persia, because I guess they feared that Persia would invade again. And then they also wanted to push the Persians out of the Aegean basin, was the other reason for it. And in fact, they fought a series of wars afterwards. They call it sometimes the Wars of the Delian League, which Pericles was involved in. And 477 to 449 was the remaining part of the wars. And they mostly were successful in pushing them out of the Aegean. Why do they call it Delian? It's named after the island of Delos, which is in the Aegean, in the Cyclades. There was a temple of Apollo there where they would meet. It's also where they kept the money for the treasury. And so that's where the actual name came from, Delian League or Delos. But what ends up happening, if you know about it, is that the Athenians, who are the main city-state in it, they take all the money from the treasury and they move it to Athens. This happens under Pericles. And so the Athenians then use this league to expand it into an empire. But it was kind of like a trading empire that the Athenians were kind of involved in with Attica, et cetera. And so that's something they kind of dominate for a while. Here's kind of, course, Acropolis of Athens. Of course, we'll talk about Pericles a little bit. Pericles is a famous politician I've talked about before. He was born in 494 BC, and eventually he would kind of take control of the city as one of its main leaders politically in 461, which he'll control Athens for something like around 30 years overall. Pericles is famous for a lot of things I've talked about before. Pericles was the one that rebuilt the Acropolis that you're looking at in that image, where he took a lot of the money from the state, like the Delian League even. They spent it lavishly on building these public buildings, like the Parthenon, I told you about some of the other temples they built. The Recthean temple was also erected as well. Temple of Temple of Athena Nike, of course, was also constructed as well around that same time overall. And then he also took the money too, and he spent a lot on their navy, like expanding the Greek navies and things like that to fight against, Persia, etc. So Pericles was a man of the people. He spent money also to, expand like Greek arts, culture, architecture, playwrights, artists, sculptors, things like that. And kind of show images right here. Of course, we've talked about before the building, of like the Parthenon, the most famous thing that was constructed, under Pericles, which Pericles, I think, completed the construction of the Parthenon close to about 430 BC, like right before I think he died. And one thing that's very famous under Pericles, there was a man named Phidias, you may have heard of. Phidias was the one that constructed a lot of the buildings on the actual Acropolis. Who was Phidias? Phidias was this famous Greek sculptor and architect, considered one of the greatest in the Greek world. And he's the one that pretty much constructed, the Parthenon, especially all the statues and the friezes that went on it. He's also the famous architect and sculptor that built the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, which had a huge statue of Zeus he constructed that was part of it. I think one of the seven wonders of the world at one point. And so, like images you'll see sometimes, paintings or whatever, showing you what the Acropolis looked like with the Parthenon a long time ago. Those are some of the friezes that were kind of put on it with statues. And some of those are controversial. They do have some called the Elgin marbles you may have heard about, which are these Greek sculptures from the Parthenon and I think also from the Acropolis. They were taken by the British in the early 1800s by this man named Thomas Bruce, who was known as the Earl of Elgin. And supposedly they took it back to Britain because they feared that the Ottoman Empire would do something to it, like harm it. And so they took like half of them to Britain, where they're now in the British Museum in London, and the other half are in Greece today still. And I think the Greeks, want it back. If you know about all these sculptures that they have that are in Britain. So it is a controversial topic, in modern history today. So there's kind of a debate about whether they should give those back, the Elgin marbles. But yeah, it just shows you the classical Greek culture art that's kind of known for that time period. And I think they're trying to rebuild, like I said, the Parthenon behind me. And so I guess I think they're trying to make replicas of it so that they're going to put on the actual Acropolis that they're reconstructing. So here's kind of another image showing you some of these, of course, Elgin marbles that are famous today. Now, I did want to talk about one more thing before I go today, which is the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, if you study about it, is when the golden age of Athens kind of comes to an end. When Athens, as a peak as its power and its empire. And the Peloponnesian War was this almost like a civil war that broke out between the Greek city-states, pretty much pitted Athens versus Sparta and their allies. Lasted about 27 years. It really wasn't one war. It was actually 3 wars. It was a series of 3 wars fought between the two sides. And part of why the wars broke out was because of the fact that Sparta was very jealous of Athens' growing power in the region. They thought they were going to take over all the Aegean basin, et cetera. And so they tried to stop them, in this conflict, which they did. And here's kind of a map showing you kind of the areas that were there. It pitted 2 sides against each other. Had like the so-called Delian League versus the Peloponnesian League. The Delian League was this alliance I told you of Greek city-states, which most of them, by the way, were Ionian that were in it. There's most of those areas that are in yellow were in the Delian League. And it included mostly these city-states or areas were in it. Attica, Euboea, which is right above Attica, that island, Thrace, the Cyclades, and parts of Western Turkey, all those different city-states were also in it as well. And then on the other side, you have the Peloponnesian League as well, pro-Dorian states. Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Olympia, Pylos were examples of city-states that backed Sparta in the war. And also the Kingdom of Macedonia, northern Greece, we'll talk about next week, also backed the Peloponnesian League, and so did Persia as well. The Persian Empire did to the east. And they think that had a lot to do with why, the Peloponnesian, League would eventually win because of Persian aid. By the way, it is a famous war that's told by this a Greek writer named Thucydides. You see right there in that image. Thucydides wrote what they call the history of the Peloponnesian War, which they think was written close to about maybe right before 400 BC. And Thucydides was actually a Greek general that fought in the war. He's kind of an eyewitness to the war itself. And they do think he's kind of like this father of scientific history. He is one of the first historians that really uses sources right and doesn't exaggerate, maybe like Herodotus did. Yeah, I think he even criticized Herodotus, believe it or not, Thucydides. He made a famous quote about the war. He said that what made the war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. That's his famous quote about the war. In the end, the Athenian power would be weakened, of course, by the Spartan rise in power. And if you go back to that map right here, kind of what happened, they both sides had different ideas about how they wanted to fight the war strategy wise. Athens tried to rely on its naval power, is what they did. And so they could use that to strike anywhere against various allies that were against them. And then, of course, Sparta, what they did was they marched up from the Peloponnese, tried to lay siege to Attica. And so Attica got so desperate, they even built fortifications to try to block the Spartan forces, the so-called long walls, I think they're sometimes called. And what really broke the Athenians was their naval power. They had this incident in 415 to 413 BC where they tried to attack Syracuse, which was an ally of Sparta in Sicily, and most of their navy was wiped out. And so from there, Sparta was able to gain more power. Part of how they did that was Persia. Persia came in and kind of formed an alliance with the Spartans. The Spartans were able to actually build their own navy afterwards and dominate the Aegean. And so a combination of Spartan naval power, Spartan armies in the end would help let them lay siege to Athens. And that was pretty much the end of the war by 404 BC. Later, they do have a deal. If you go to this map down here, I'll kind of share with you. Yeah, I kind of show right here. But yeah, after the war, kind of some things that happened to kind of give you a perspective of what occurred following the Greco-Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. Yeah, there's no more dominance by Athens. So Athens is not really a major power compared to some of the city-states afterwards. Thebes and Sparta actually for a long time vied for power in the 4th century. It's one of the main things that happens. But actually, you know what ends up happening? Thebes eventually defeats Sparta, which they will by about 371 BC. They have this thing called the Theban-Spartan War that occurs. And the Boeotians, where Thebes is, they eventually defeat Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. And Thebes ends up being the big power, for a while in the mid part of the 4th century. But to the north, you've got Macedonia that's coming to power. The Kingdom of Macedon, of course, under King Philip II, Alexander the Great, of course. And those powers are really going to take over Greece eventually, take control of it. And Alexander and his father Philip have this idea where they think they want to try to get all the Greeks to kind of combine together to fight against Persia. And so that's what's going to happen next. Alexander's going to invade the Persian Empire. And that's going to lead to a new period in history we'll get to later called the Hellenistic Age, where Greek culture is kind of spread to the Near East. We'll discuss, the conquests of Alexander the Great, of course, which will follow after that. Looks like I did have a bunch of students I know that came in late, of course, at the end of the lecture. Looks like Christian, I know, joined us. Hey, what's up this morning, Christian? Also, Becky had joined us as well. Good morning. Also, looks like Kelsey, Samantha. Also, it looks like Sean also joined us as well, and a few others like Kayla. Hey, good morning. Also, Tristan as well. And then also Amanda also joined us this morning as well. So anyway, that wraps up my lecture, of course, on the Greco-Persian Wars and aftermath, of course, in Greek history. Next week, I'll have two things for you video-wise. I'll have, of course, I'm going to work on a review, of course, for the second exam, which I'll probably post maybe on Monday. It might not be till Monday to actually post the upcoming second exam to kind of give you some time to kind of review over the lecture material. And then I will have it might be a recorded lecture I'll have on the period of Alexander the Great, like his conquests and the Hellenistic Age. That's going to be put on some kind of bonus assignment I'll give you for extra credit towards the second exam to help you out with some points in the class. So that's kind of my schedule for next week that I have. So anyway, kind of that's it for today. It doesn't look like there's any historical questions I see. But if you do have a question, about the lectures, you can post comments, questions, of course, either on my channel with the actual lectures or also don't forget Canvas discussions. Also, don't forget about that. You can leave comments, questions there about the class. If you got a question about the class, you can also email me as well. Everybody's got my email address pretty much also. So that's it for today. I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. Kind of a cold day today, isn't it? So I'll see y'all later. Y'all have a great rest of the week.